Hey, hi there. Nice to meet you. Welcome to my channel. I'm Bob of the Old Ways, and I want to say something. I got to get this off my chest. I am a Generation X straight white man who's read The Lord of the Rings probably more than any other novel I've read in my life. And yes, Sam and Frodo are totally gay. Totally. Deal with it. So here's an article that broke the brains of the anti-woke crowd on YouTube this week, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first I want to ask you a question, in all sincerity. Imagine that you are a fantasy author, and one of the characters that you want to include in your grand sweeping epic is a closeted gay man, perhaps a closeted bisexual man, who is deeply in love with your male protagonist, his best friend, but feels for any number of reasons that he cannot express his romantic interest and never pursues sexual intimacy with his object of love. Instead, he goes on a quest with this man that he's in love with and sublimates those desires and expresses them in other ways, chiefly through amazing acts of bravery and self-sacrifice. And after the quest is done, they go home together and they settle down together. The closeted man marries a woman and has children with her. And when he's married to this woman, he moves her into the same house with himself and his male best friend with whom he's in love. So he gets married and has kids, but he never gives up on or forgets his unrequited romance for the male protagonist. Now, if you wanted to include that character arc in your story, I ask you sincerely, how would it look much different than the story of Sam and Frodo in The Lord of the Rings? I submit to you that it would not look very different at all. Now, I am not saying that Tolkien intended his audience to read Sam and Frodo as gay lovers. I'm just saying that's what he wound up with, even if he didn't intend that at all. And newsflash, an author's word on his text is never the last word. The author's intent is never the full meaning of a text. Let's talk about why that's important.
Our new entry for woke projection comes from Polygon, and this long-winded rant by Molly Ostertag claiming that Frodo and Sam are gay because they're friends. Or as Molly says, quote, revisiting the book in the last year as someone who has been out for many years and who is deeply engaged in making and consuming queer stories, I was amazed to find the same-sex love story at the heart of the narrative. Where, unlike you, I've read the books every year for nearly 20 years and watched the films well over 100 times. Where is the gay love story? It would...
Now hold on there. She didn't say gay love story. She said same-sex love story. I think that is self-evident on its face. No one who reads Lord of the Rings, no fan of Lord of the Rings, disputes that Sam and Frodo have a very deep and abiding love for each other that they both express across the entire span of the story. They are the same sex. This may seem like a distinction without a difference to some of you, but it really isn't. Let's continue. I'll elaborate more in a minute.
Be impossible to miss since Tolkien is usually explicit about how characters feel about each other. Where is this mysterious gay love story you found that no one else did? Oh, you mean Frodo and Sam being close friends, or really mirroring the bond between an officer and his servant, his Batman, in the British military? Tolkien included that element in his story, which explains Sam's devotion to Frodo and how he takes care of Frodo and his needs. Tolkien even mentions this in his letters, quote, my Samwise is indeed, as you know, largely a reflection of the English soldier, grafted on the village boys of early days, the memory of privates and my batmen that I knew in the 1914 war, and recognized as so far superior to myself. To interpret that relationship as sexual when it clearly is not undermines Tolkien's point about the character and quality of the working and rural class and their importance to the war, the community, and their officers. Tolkien loved applicability over allegory, but all the same, that doesn't mean you get to change his intentions to suit your own.
Yes, it does. The author's word, the author's intent on their text is never the last word. We're not talking about, well, even with sacred texts, even with things like the Bible, that's not the case. People bring their own readings into a text, and people with perspectives different than yours can discover new depths to a text that you may not have been aware of. See, underlying this whole, before I elaborate on that point, I want to point out the sleight of hand that Just Some Guy performed here by saying there's no sexual relationship between Sam and Frodo. That's obviously true. That doesn't mean there's no romance between them. Queerness is not simply about who you have sex with, or how you have sex, or whether you have sex at all. More about that in a minute. Underlying this insistence that we prioritize the intent of Tolkien or any other author is a debate, a conflict. I guess you could call it a dichotomy in literary textual analysis, in literary theory and literary criticism that maybe Just Some Guy and the other people I'm going to show you in this video may not be aware of. It comes down to really, there are two basic schools of thought about how to interpret a text and how to determine the primary meaning of a text. One focuses on authorial intent, that we should study not just what the author wrote in their book or their film or whatever the text is. We should also look at the author's notes about their work, the author's political or cultural situation, the author's lifestyle, the author's identity, all these other things, to determine what they were trying to say in the work and make that the primary meaning of the text. And that's a perfectly valid way to interpret a text, but it is not the only way, and it is certainly not the only correct way. The other school of thought is popularly called Death of the Author, after an essay by Roland Barthes of the same name. And Death of the Author basically says that the primary meaning of a text is the way it is received by the reader. What does it say to the reader? What does the reader bring to the text? What is the impact of the text on the audience? The impact of a text on the audience should take priority over the author's intent. Death of the Author is based on a couple of different motives. One is the desire to validate the experiences, the lived experiences of individual readers who don't have the cultural privilege of being an author. The other one is to remember that humans are often mysteries to ourselves, and we are not always aware of our intent. Often the things we say or do or express through art are expressions of our unconscious desires and our unconscious biases. So we can put things into a text without consciously intending it, and without maybe even knowing that we did it. And other people who have a lived experience that allows them to see those things better than us may see it in our text. And it is therefore as true as anything we intended to put in. Now, Death of the Author is also a perfectly valid way to interpret a text, but it is not the only way. It is certainly not the only correct way. And the problem here is that Just Some Guy and Clownfish TV and Heels versus Babyface, the two other folks I'm going to show you, are operating on the assumption or making the argument that an author's intent is the final word, and anyone who wants to put any other interpretation or any other reading onto the text is objectively wrong. And they are objectively wrong to say that. They may not even be aware of this tension in literary criticism, but it is there. And I want to put a flag in that as we proceed, because it's important to remember. And it's a reflection. The preference for authorial intent over death of the author is a preference based on culture, based on politics, based on identity, that the people making the argument for it may not even be aware that they have.
Real world, some of the Batmen probably did hook up with their officers, but most of them didn't, and there's nothing.
How do you
not
know?
a single thing in Lord of the Rings to remotely suggest that Frodo and Sam were knocking proud feet. But reality never stops the woke. Quote, there are many relationships between men in the book, most of them platonic. No, all of them are platonic. All of them. Not a single one of the relationships between the men in the books are anything other than friendships or brotherhood. Interpreting things like Sam holding Frodo's hand or touching his hair as sexual is ridiculous when you consider the context. Frodo nearly died. Frodo is carrying an item that's twisting his mind. Sam is comforting Frodo, not trying to shag him. I know this is difficult for some people to understand, but two men can care deeply for each other, and it has nothing to do with sex.
Okay, there's actually a fair point here, but before I concede it, I will point out that, once again, Just Some Guy has reduced queerness merely to sex. They're not the same thing. The fact that a relationship is platonic between two men or two people of the same sex or gender does not mean it isn't queer. It can be both. If one of them is queer and the other one is not, it's a queer romance. Whether they have sex or not, whether they both feel the same way or not, doesn't matter. Queerness. I've learned this as a straight man, as a straight Generation X man who has spent the last few years paying attention and listening to marginalized people. I've learned this about queerness. And I think it's a lesson that a lot of straight people, especially younger straight men like this guy, could stand to learn. Queerness is not about sex. It's not just about who you are attracted to. It's about love. Queerness is a type of love, or queer relationships are a type of love. If you are a straight person and you've ever been or currently are in a committed relationship with a person of the opposite sex, let's say you're a man, a straight man, you're in a committed relationship with a woman, and you are madly in love with this woman, you know it involves more than just sex. It's love, it's anger, it's passion, it's fear, it is so many other things, the full range of human emotion. It's exactly the same way for queer people who are in love with one another. And for you to reduce it down to just sex betrays a pretty surprising lack of empathy on your part. And it's also somewhat homophobic, genuinely homophobic, because you have reduced the humanity of another person down to their genital preference. And queer people are much, much more than that. So, yes, a relationship can be platonic. A deeply loving relationship between two people of the same sex can be platonic and also be queer. They are not mutually exclusive of each other. That being said, Just Some Guy touches on a valid point here. Let's listen to more of what he has to say, and then I'll elaborate a bit.
This with cops and firemen. We see this with athletes. There's a reason we have the phrase closer than brothers. It's not sexual. It's just a very intense bond. And it's often expressed by physical contact.
This doesn't mean it's not queer.
The forehead,
None of this means it's not queer.
On each other. Yes, in our modern society, this might get read as being gay. But anyone who checks history
Here we go.
will see these types of things were done throughout every society.
Yeah.
It's extremely common to the point that it gets encoded in mythology, like with Gilgamesh and Enkidu or David and Jonathan. You're reading way more into this bond than is there.
No, you're not.
It doesn't just taint those
Perfectly
stories,
valid reading.
It also prevents real men and boys from forming those bonds.
Here we go.
After they may be labeled gay. We've seen this with young men and boys having fewer friendships, especially friendships of any meaning. If the moment they show any emotional connection it will be read as a come on, a lot of men and boys won't form those strong friendships. It also makes it worse for gay men and boys because if they really are just trying to be someone's friend, it could be misinterpreted, resulting in them having to fend off an unwanted suitor or someone who hates them because they're gay. You're also making gay men and boys less likely to form strong friendships with straight men and boys out of fear that their own intentions might be misinterpreted.
Okay, yeah, I see that.
You're creating more problems by projecting sexuality onto everything.
There is something of a valid point here. I too have often felt that the impulse to label everything, every display of emotional intimacy between same-sex characters in a work of fiction, the rush to label that as gay immediately, I confess, felt that does make it harder sometimes for straight people like me to have to indulge in and publicly express emotionally intimate friendships with other men. But who's the enemy here? The enemy is not gay people. The enemy is homophobia. If you want a world in which it is acceptable and safe for straight men to have emotionally intimate relationships with other men, relationships that include public displays of affection such as touching, hair stroking, kissing, and so forth, and you don't want that to be read as immediately gay and met with the potential for violence, then you should be standing in solidarity with queer people, not blaming them for the culture that they didn't create. The problem here is homophobia. The problem here is queer phobia. It's not queerness. The problem is not injecting a queer reading into a text that wasn't intended to have it. The problem is that you see yourself as antagonistic to queer people rather than as an ally. And as long as that is the case, you will never have a world in which it's safe for straight men to express their deep love for their friends in physical ways without being confronted by the threat of violence. You can't have that world if you're going to consider queer people the enemy.
Just because other people wrote about gay shit doesn't mean Tolkien did it too.
He could have done it by
not how this
accident.
works. Was he aware that some men fancy other men? Probably. As Molly mentions, one of the Inklings, Tolkien's group of friends, was gay. He was friends with and a fan of Mary Rinwald, who wrote several gay-themed novels. None of that is evidence, though, that Frodo and Sam were secretly written as gay. There's nothing in the published text, Tolkien's notes, the drafts published by his son, or his letters that even hint at the idea. Trying to read more into Tolkien's work than what's there, especially things like Bilbo being a bachelor or Tolkien using the word queer, meaning strange, or Legolas and Gimli's friendship, is just pulling at straws. They're not gay. Lord of the Rings isn't some hidden metaphor about being gay, and nothing you say will change that.
All right, let's talk about the concept of subtext here and subconscious. This, I think, is the point Molly Ostertag is trying to make in her article. Tolkien was a man of his time who seems to, at least in his personal life, have been tolerant of gay people in his life, unlike his friend C.S. Lewis, who wanted nothing to do with gay people. Tolkien was friends with a gay writer, W.H. Auden, very close friends, and as just some guy notes, he was a friend of and fan of Mary Renaud and published a lot and helped her publish her poetry and praised her gay-themed novels. Tolkien also was very deeply moved by the relationship between badmen and officers that he witnessed during World War I and that he himself experienced during World War I. And he knew, because he knew gay people, that sometimes those relationships were gay romances that were closeted. Now, does this mean he intended Sam and Frodo to be a gay romance? No, it does not mean that. But what it might mean is that Tolkien was such a keen observer of the human condition that the emotions he felt, how, the way he was deeply moved by those officer and Batman relationships in World War One, that when he expressed them on the page, he put more into them than even he realized. He captured the essence of closeted gay romance, even though he didn't know he did it. I think that's the point of what Ostertag is saying in her article. I've linked it down below. You should go read it. It's very fascinating. So the idea that just because Tolkien did not consciously intend to make Sam and Frodo queer doesn't mean he didn't. And the fact that he never knew or never thought that he might have made Sam and Frodo queer doesn't mean he didn't. Now, I'm not saying it's objectively true that he did make them queer. That's the whole point here. The death of the author allows us to uncover depths in a text that the author may not have intended us to uncover, that the author may not even have been aware were there. And I can say, as a straight person who read Lord of the Rings multiple times, that after I had engaged with queer people and queer readings of texts and paid attention to and truly listened to my queer friends, when I went back and reread The Lord of the Rings with the understanding that many queer people saw themselves in the relationship between Sam and Frodo, it added new layers of depth and meaning to my own reading, and I was able to enjoy the book in a whole new way. I was able to experience literature as an empathy technology, which is basically what literature is and why literature is a kind of magic. So all of this blathering on about what Tolkien intended, what Tolkien meant to say, is really beside the point. It does not invalidate a reading of Frodo and Sam as queer, and it does not even invalidate the claim that Tolkien put that in there, whether he meant to or not. It's not simply somebody inserting their own agenda into The Lord of the Rings. It is someone with a perspective that you don't share, that doesn't reflect your lived experience, who is uncovering a meaning and a thread in the text that has always been there, and you were just not capable of noticing it because you didn't have the right frame of reference. And that's okay. No one is saying you're bad for not doing that. You couldn't help it. None of us can. So I think we're pretty much done with Just Some Guy here. He does admit right after this, by the way, that Tolkien invites people to bring their own reading into a text. Watch him say it.
Like to apply aspects of the story to your gayness, Tolkien invites you to do this.
Mm-hmm.
He preferred people to use applicability over allegory, but, like I said before, you don't get to change his intentions to suit your own.
No one is changing his intentions to suit their own. That's the point here. Ostertag is simply postulating, that it's possible for Tolkien to have intended a gay or queer subtext to Sam and Frodo without consciously being aware of it. That his keen observation of the human condition and his deep love for the Batman officer relationship that was sometimes a gay romance enabled him to put that into the subtext of that relationship without noticing it. That's all. So let's move on from Just Some Guy and check out some other folks who have some similar takes.
Nobody wants to see a horny golem or a orc with a raging hard-ons. Oh, no.
No, of course
So
not.
why shouldn't some of Middle-earth's denizens be gay? Oh, okay, I actually thought this was going to be a difficult video. It's because Tolkien didn't write them that way.
And that is 100% irrelevant. The author's intent is not the final word on the meaning of a text. See the earlier bits of this video. It does not matter at all whether Tolkien intended the Sam-Frodo relationship to be read as gay. It can be read as gay because it is in the text. If you don't see it, that doesn't mean it's not there. Your experience of a text is not the only one, and authorial intent is not the only correct way to read a text. Get over yourself.
And Tolkien is a very specific writer. And no matter how much you project, it doesn't actually change that that's not what he was saying. Okay? Wonderful.
No, not okay. It's not projecting. It is someone with a lived experience you don't have, finding new layers of meaning in the text that have always been there, that Tolkien put there, even if he didn't know he put them there. That's what's going on here. It's not a personal attack against you. It's not about you. Your reading of the text is not the only possible reading. Tolkien's intent for a text is not the only possible reading. Neither of them is the correct reading. Get over yourself.
Because now it's, these characters were actually gay, just Tolkien couldn't say anything about it because he wasn't allowed to because it was the 1950s.
No. That's not what she's saying. Not really. What she's saying, I've read this article 3 times, okay? And I have to question the reading comprehension of all of these commentators. What Ostertag is saying is that Tolkien captured something about closeted queer romance in his time without really knowing that he did it, because he was an empathetic man who was tolerant of queer people in his personal life and was deeply moved by the emotional intimacy of male relationships in wartime, which often did turn out to be gay relationships. So being such a keen observer of the human condition and being such a deeply empathetic person, Tolkien was able to capture something of the essence of closeted queer romance in his own time, even though he didn't intend to do it. That's the point. I don't see how anyone can read this article in good faith and come to any other conclusion.
To me, as someone who's a creator myself, basically your works are going to be okay after we fix them. That's what I'm upset about. It's like, if we don't like them, then go do something, go find a different one or make a new something.
As a creator, I'm a creator myself. You may find out more about that in the future if things go as I hope they do. If you are a creator of fictional works and you are worried that, or you are deterred from making them because you think that once you are done with them, other people will find meanings or inject meanings in the text that you didn't intend, then you need to stop being a creator. You don't control other people's reactions to your art. You cannot control them, and you cannot dictate them either. Creative works speak to different people in different ways, and other people can absolutely find meaning in your work that is objectively there that you didn't know you put there. Because if you're doing your job right as a creator, as an artist, as a writer, if you're doing that job right, you have reflected a universal human condition. If you're really good at it, it'll seem like magic to people, and it'll seem like magic to you. So stop with this obsession that other people find meanings in texts that you don't find, and calling that injecting or inserting or forcing or projecting. That's not what's happening. They're just uncovering meanings that have always been there, objectively have always been there, even if you did not notice them.
Looking for something you're you're going to find it. That's what they always say. If you're out there looking for something, if you're looking for problems, you're going to find it. If you're looking for a certain thing, there was an experiment.
And sometimes you'll find them without looking. That's the experience. That's the experience Ostertag is conveying to you. It's not that she went looking for a queer reading of The Lord of the Rings. It's that she found one quite to her surprise. She says as much in the opening paragraph of the story. Because it's always been there. It doesn't matter if Tolkien intended to put it there. It is objectively there. The fact that you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. Your reading of a text is not the only reading. The author's conscious intent of a text is not the final word on what the text contains and what the text means. Get over yourself.
Again, context. Tolkien was in the military.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Back in the day, and this is Anthony Mackie had to smack some people down too about this. Back in the day, guys in the military, they had a very close bond. They were very much like brothers. When you talk about loving your brother in arms, loving your brother, it wasn't loving your brother. Oh, it might have been loving your brother.
Oh, it might have been?
Don't talk about that much either.
Well, isn't that the point here? Isn't that Ostertag's whole point? The context of Tolkien's conceptualizing of Sam and Frodo is in large part Tolkien's experiences in World War I as an officer with a Batman and witnessing those close bonds of brotherly love, and sometimes more than brotherly love, among soldiers. And I think that what might be bothering people here is the fluidity of that situation, the implication that it may not be easy to tell the difference between two straight men who have an emotionally intimate relationship with one another and two gay men who also express their love through public displays of physical affection. I think that's what's making people uncomfortable here. And again, I will emphasize this again. If you want to have a world in which it is okay for straight men to have emotionally intimate relationships that they can publicly express through physical contact, light kissing, and so forth, without facing persecution, then you need to recognize that the problem there is homophobia, and the enemy is not gay people or woke people inserting their experience into a text. The enemy is the culture that targets both of you. And you need to, if you want the world in which it's okay to express purely brotherly love between two straight men without persecution, you should be standing in solidarity with queer people, not mocking them.
Okay, and that's everything I have read, everything I have understood about Tolkien was there was so much of his experience in the military that he put into Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
And a lot of that, the Sam and Frodo were they were had a brotherly bond, and they were up against this unstoppable force, and they had to persevere and they had to rely on each other. And they were in the battlefield, and that was my understanding.
Right, and that's a valid understanding. I would say it's even an accurate understanding. But the thing is, as you slyly indicated a moment ago, sometimes those relationships were also queer relationships, even if they did not have sex. Sometimes it was the case that this brotherly bond became something different, and Tolkien probably recognized that. He lived through this experience. There's no indication that he ever had a gay romance or felt gay romantic love, queer romantic love for another man or for one of his soldier brothers, but he almost certainly experienced it, and his tolerance for queer people and his tolerance for queer people in his personal life should lead you to understand that it's possible for him to have captured the essence of a queer romance without intending to. That's the magic of literature. If you're good at it, which Tolkien absolutely was, you will have injected meanings into your text that you don't even know were there.
I have never gotten gay from Sam and Frodo.
No, especially since Sam kept talking about,
It doesn't matter if you got something gay from Sam and Frodo. Your experience of a text is not the only correct experience. It's perfectly valid that you didn't see something gay there. I read The Lord of the Rings multiple times for probably 20 years, and I never saw it there either. But as soon as my queer friends pointed it out to me, I immediately understood what they saw, and it immediately rang true to me. It's a perfectly valid reading of the text. It is not someone injecting or projecting or using confirmation bias to see something that isn't there. It is someone using their lived experience to uncover a layer of meaning that is objectively in the text, whether Tolkien intended it or not. That's how literature works. Get over yourself.
since Sam kept talking about,
Rosie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Really? He did?
there's
No,
that.
he did. He really didn't.
Everybody keeps forgetting that Sam marries Rosie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
That doesn't mean he's not gay.
I mean, whatever. Anyway. It just goes on and on.
So Just Some Guy made this point as well, right? Both Clownfish TV here and Just Some Guy in the previous video both claimed that at the beginning of the story, Clownfish TV didn't explicitly claim this, but Just Some Guy says that at the beginning of the story, Rosie is around and Sam is reluctant to talk to her and spends the entire story talking about her. That is not true. That's just not true. Rosie is not mentioned in Lord of the Rings until the Mount Doom chapter, which is well into Return of the King, and it's basically in passing. And the entire relationship and marriage between Sam and Rosie doesn't happen and is not elaborated on until towards I think like book 6 chapter 8 or so, like the Scouring of the Shire. That's where it really comes to light. And okay, it's beautiful, I get that, but here's the thing: the argument that Sam cannot have had queer romantic feelings for Frodo because he was attracted to Rosie and wanted to marry her is it just displays a deep ignorance of queer lived experiences. There's a reason we have the phrase "in the closet." One thing I've learned from my queer friends, especially being Generation X, a lot of my queer friends were in the closet at the time that I became friends with them, and I did not know they were queer. Many of them were married. Many of them had kids. It's an integral part of the queer experience, at least if you're of a certain generation, to hide in the closet. And also we should point out that polyamory is a thing. In The Lord of the Rings, Sam marries Rosie and then moves her in to live with Frodo. They're all living together. What's going on there? Okay, so the argument that Sam married Rosie and had children, therefore he could not have been gay, doesn't hold water. There are tons and tons of real life queer people who married someone of the opposite sex that they deeply cared about, but were not romantically in love with necessarily, just so they could protect themselves from persecution. So, to ignore that and to think that being married to someone of the opposite sex is proof that a real person or a fictional person is not queer, again, displays a deep lack of empathy and a deep ignorance about queer lived experiences. Now, I am a straight man. I am not qualified to elaborate much further than that, but I would suggest that you just find some queer friends of of your own and listen to them. Read queer literature. Read queer analytical theory. Read queer literary theory. Consume queer content on YouTube. Listen to these people with empathy, and you will understand a whole lot more about the Lord of the Rings than you ever expected to. I mean, I really find this the whole character of this type of discussion about franchises a little bit weird. I grew up, as I've mentioned a couple times in this video, I'm Generation X, and I grew up watching the development of fandom into a kind of a mystery box culture where people approach a franchise or a story or a text as if it's a mystery to be solved. And it's not a mystery to be solved. And the fandom over the years has developed the idea that a particular reading of a text, like let's say a queer reading of Sam and Frodo in Lord of the Rings, cannot possibly be valid unless you uncover clues in the text that prove it to the satisfaction of some other person who doesn't have your reading. If you can't prove using evidence from the text, if you can't solve the mystery and prove to the person who doesn't share your reading that your reading is correct and theirs is wrong, then it's not a valid reading. And I just think that is a really silly and dumb way to approach fandom. And I really think fandom of all sorts, especially Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Marvel, because those are the three big ones, but really any fandom really needs to look in the mirror and just examine what the heck we're doing. Literature is sublime. Literature is magic. Literature is deeply personal to those who read it. And the dismissive attitude that someone else's reading of a text that you didn't have cannot be valid because the author didn't intend it that way or you didn't see it is deeply arrogant, deeply ignorant, deeply dehumanizing. So I'll just leave it at that. I hope you enjoy my content. If you do, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. And until next time, I am Bob of the Old Ways. Remember that what is best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women.